It's a beautiful night in the hood. It's a beautiful night in the hood. Gonna be hanging out in the hood.
Hi, welcome to Almost Cooperstown.
I'm Mark.
And this is Gordon, and we love talking about baseball. Utility players are just such an interesting discussion to have with baseball because, in a sense, it's an inherently kind of insulting thing to designate a player in a way. Because the idea with a utility guy is just like, oh, you're a utility guy because you're not good enough to just play at any one position.
Let's start with this premise, okay? So this is an Almost Cooperstown blog, and we talk about, a podcast, and we talk about, players that are on the precipice. Are there any, in your mind, utility players who are either in the Hall of Fame or belong in the Hall of Fame?
See, I guess this is where it's difficult because you'd almost say like a guy you would say would in some ways classify as a utility player that's in the Hall of Fame. Craig Biggio. Played catcher, second base, outfield. Won a Gold Glove at both second base and in the outfield. But nobody would ever say Craig Biggio is a utility player.
He was a versatile player.
He was a versatile
and an impressive versatile player, right? Being a catcher, a second baseman, an outfielder.
Yeah,
wow.
Up the middle. The only thing he didn't do was pitch. But you would never call Craig Biggio a utility player.
Right.
So there's something inherently lesser, I feel like, by getting designated a utility player. Like,
right, and I think you made a point off air that I think is really a really good one, and that is a utility player is most likely somebody that plays multiple positions within the same season on a team.
Which is a big difference between how a lot of guys get used, because you have some guys like I remember Daniel Murphy with the Mets. He played second base, he played first base. I think he even played some outfield at one point.
He did.
But he was never really swapping around that much during a season.
I think early in his career he played multiple positions, but actually he was best for the Mets at first, but it wasn't best for the team that he played first. They tried to find another place for him to play.
The issue was Murphy wasn't getting moved around because of his defensive versatility. He was getting moved around because of how offensive his defensive was.
Right, exactly. Where can we hide this guy?
Yeah, exactly. So I think you run into the problem with a lot of utility guys like that, where it's difficult to really say that any of them would be in the Hall of Fame, because if you were good enough to be in the Hall of Fame, you probably would have mostly stuck to one position for your team.
Yeah, and in case, we'll just staying on Murphy a second. And I remember he was fairly competent at first base, but he was more valuable to the team as a really good hitting second baseman.
Because the problem that you ran into was until he had that breakout 2015 postseason where all of a sudden he learned to hit for power, and he was doing a lot of his moving around before that, you really couldn't have teams weren't going to tolerate a first baseman that played subpar to maybe acceptable defense.
Yeah, good enough defense.
Who would hit 320, but he'd hit 9 home runs.
Right.
You couldn't have that.
Right.
If he was going to do that, he needed to be JT Snow and play Gold Glove first base defense. And then you can hit only 9 home runs.
And to his credit, Murphy worked hard to become as competent a second baseman as he could be, turning the double play.
And I remember the thing with Murph that was frustrating was he actually had it in him to make incredible plays, but then he would also had it in him to make incredibly horrific plays where you'd be like, how did you mess that up?
Had a little John Starks in him out there for sure. It's definitely the kind of thing we think about a utility player. And this season, the Red Sox picked up Kike Hernandez, and who before I think was thought of as a utility player on the Dodgers. At least in my mind, he was a guy who didn't necessarily play every day. But when he did play, he was effective. If he played too much, maybe you would start to see that he wasn't as
And I think that's kind of where it comes in with a lot of, especially what we would consider true utility men. Not guys that had versatility. Like Ben Zobrist with the Cubs. He was the kind of guy that he had versatility, so they could use him in a lot of different ways. But his role was pretty consistent within the team year to year, like within the context of that single season. Whereas with a guy like Kike, his value was you were going to be able to kind of plug him in wherever you needed him on the field, and he was going to provide you a guy that was better than a standard zero WAR player, but he probably wasn't going to be as good as whoever your regular starter would have been in that position.
And it seems, because he was on the Dodgers last year and they're the world champions, it seems that the Dodgers sort of seek this kind of player out in a guy like Chris Taylor, who in a sense is now he's playing almost exclusively outfield, but does play second base for them, and Cody Bellinger has won. I don't know if he's won Gold Gloves, but he plays outfield and then he played first base, and so he does two. It's not like he's playing DH, right? And let's get that straight for a second. Like being a DH and a position player, that doesn't count as being utility player.
Okay, so now we have not talked about this, but I just thought of something. Does Ohtani count as a utility player?
No, no,
he's playing outfield and he's pitching.
Yeah.
No, he obviously does it because he's actually the first real true two-way player.
Right.
In a sense, in a long time.
Right.
Because there used to be two-way players, but not like this is different. So, but right there, even though he is being used in multiple different ways that provides a lot of utility, you would never classify Ohtani as a utility player.
No, I'd say he's one heck of a versatile player.
Right, and I think that's the
better word.
That's the better word for guys that like. And that's generally going to be the distinction between the upper echelon utility guys and true utility men. Like, who was the utility guy for the Mets that they had?
Joe McEwing.
Yep.
Super Joe.
Joe McEwing could play pretty much wherever they needed him on the field. I think he even caught once.
I checked this out. He played every position on the field, not necessarily for the Mets, but he was the third catcher on the Mets. And when the second catcher would nick him, one guy was out injured, and the guy hurts his finger. McEwing's got to get the gear. And but he never had to go into a major league game and catch.
But
And yet he, I don't know, was his career average 270 or something like that? He hit well enough and could play enough positions that he was useful.
Yes, and I think that's the and when you look at World Series winning teams, how many World Series winning teams really you would say had a dedicated utility man? Yeah, that they utilized a lot. That's the other thing. Because teams will have guys that they consider their utility guy and then just have them on the bench the entire season.
Yeah, it's a good point. Because in the 69 Mets had the MVP of the World Series is a guy named Al Weiss. Okay, you've never heard of this player.
Nope.
Okay, Al Weiss came from the White Sox to the Mets, and he was what you'd call an infielder. So he would back up Harrelson at shortstop. Occasionally he'd play some second base for Boswell on the Mets. But he was a super sub because he just didn't play enough games to be anything. So is that a utility player or just an infielder who doesn't play that much?
Yeah, exactly. Like I feel like, but then again, inherently, if you're going to say that's a utility player, a super sub implies they're not good enough to be starter.
He hit Look, the guy didn't hit home runs at all, right? He hit 3 home runs in the World Series.
It happens exactly. Yeah, and that's just he had the 6 or 7 game stretch of his life in that World Series.
But here's what I did: is I tried to come up with some criteria for what I would consider to be notable or excellence in terms of guys that were multi-position players.
And so we're saying multi-position means any infield position or catcher and any outfield position. DHing doesn't count because it just doesn't count.
So, any outfield position, right? You said?
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah. So, I tried to say, well, what if you played 160, look, what should qualify is you had to play 162 games at the position.
Throughout your career.
Right. Now, remember that you can start the game at shortstop, and you can move to left field.
We were talking,
and that would count as having played both positions.
We were actually talking about this because we were talking about a guy that came. It's also how they come up. Like you had a guy like Dale Murphy, who you were saying came up as a catcher.
I just remember that being like, oh, Murphy. But I was shocked that he only caught
85 games.
I don't know why. I thought he was a catcher.
But then he played 1,800 games in the outfield and maybe 200 at first base. But you would never consider him a utility player.
No, nor would I consider him. I don't even remember him playing first base.
Right.
I just remember he was a 2-time MVP in a row, by the way, and was an outfielder and was a much better outfielder than I thought at the time. I think he won Gold Gloves in the outfield, I'm pretty sure. And he certainly wasn't a Gold Glove catcher, but his ability to hit a catcher is why the Braves decided he's not a catcher. Let's put him in the outfield. We want this guy to hit.
We want this guy not to run down his body in 8 years.
But if you take it out to 162 games, and then this is just an arbitrary criteria, right? That gives us some way of measuring this stuff. The guys that played 4 different positions through their career of 162 games or more is a real dividing line. There's lots of guys that played more than 162 games at 3 different positions.
Right, and that can even just as much happen because you have some guy that's capable of playing like all 3 outfield positions. So like over the course
But
of
that doesn't count. No, that doesn't count.
Oh, okay.
I'm
You're
only
just counting it as
outfield.
general. Oh, okay.
Well, you play outfield. You play outfield. Doesn't
Right.
matter if you play
Oh,
left.
okay.
So
But
that
still,
seemed to be too parsing.
Too parsing. Yeah, that's fair.
So Zobrist is a guy you talked about.
Yeah,
Okay,
he played
he
second,
did-
third,
correct.
outfield. I
Guy
think
named
even some-
Rance Mulinix, who played for the Blue Jays. Matzer Itsuris, guy. Jose Oquendo only played for only on 2. So if you take the 3 guys, it just meant you hung around long enough.
And there was even some good current players like Matt Carpenter.
Right, has played more than 162 games at 3 different positions.
But you don't think of him as a utility player.
Martin Prado, good infielder, but he played first base late in his career, so he's a second baseman.
Prado was a guy that I would consider more of a utility. He was closer to a utility
Closer,
guy.
but I don't know that he did that in the season. Maybe
No.
one year he played second base a lot, and another year, and late in his career he played first base. So those 3, Tony Fernandez, who's got a career WAR, by the way, of 45.3. He's an almost guy and a guy a lot of people forget about. Played shortstop, played second base and third base in his career, and played them all very well and was a very, very good hitter. So to me, he's one of the higher ranked guys of those played 162 at 3 positions in his career. But once you cross over, and I'm just trying to make sure that I don't have any other. So Toby Harrah is another guy. I don't know if you've ever heard of Toby
I've never
Harrah.
heard of him.
Very good player. Career WAR of 51.
I mean, that's pretty high.
That's pretty high, right? And he led the American League in games at third base 4 times, but he played 162 games at 3 different positions.
But then again, you get to some guys that are they played 162 games at 3 positions and they just sucked at all of them, like
Well,
Juan Castro.
And we've talked about this player before because he's got the distinction of as a fielder of not being a very good one. So Pedro Guerrero played for the Dodgers. Pedro Guerrero was a major league accomplished hitter. Okay, nearly 300 home runs, 290 career average. Just the dude could rake, a little like J.D. Davis in that respect. And played third base 500 games at third. 373 at third, and he played 500 games at first base and in the outfield. That's pretty, versatile.
Yeah.
Right, when they do that, except that he was not good at any of those things, and famously said, when Steve Sachs had his throwing issues for the Dodgers, I don't know if you've heard this story or not. He is playing second base, and Steve had the throwing it again, and he couldn't release the ball. They asked Pedro Guerrero, so Pedro, when you're at third base, what are you thinking? And he goes, oh God, please don't let them hit the ball to me. He goes, and then what are you thinking after that? He goes, oh God, please don't let them hit it to Steve Sachs. And Guerrero, just wherever they put him, they couldn't find a place.
So it was like that reminded me of that story. Who was it? I knew he was okay because he hasn't hit the cutoff man all year.
Oh, that was Winfield. Couldn't hit the bird. Yeah. Couldn't have tried to hit the bird because he didn't. That was Billy Martin with a great line. So let's go to the guys that had 4.
And that immediately shrinks the list of
really small
dramatically.
And Met fans will notice names on this list because there are, let's see, 3 guys who on this list of, I don't know, where there's 7 guys that.
Granted, 2 of them really, I would say, even all 3 of them really didn't spend a majority of their career with the Mets. They just had stints with them.
Okay, so let's start with Greg Jeffries. So Greg Jeffries came up with the '88 Mets.
He was supposed to be like a superstar.
He was the
right?
phenom. They had the articles in the paper in Sports Illustrated of him swinging the bat underwater. His dad was teaching him how to keep it. Oh, you don't know that any of this stuff.
I mean, I remember he was like one. It was like the first 6-tool product or something.
Manufactured product, a little like Todd Marinovich was in football in terms of the Robo QB. He was the Robo baseball player.
Where like it was almost just like a marketing machine put together by his father that turned him into.
Dude could hit.
Right.
Could really hit.
But he was turned into a star. He wasn't given the...
They anointed him the star.
Yeah.
It turns out he had a very good major league career overall. He played more than 162 games at 4 different positions. And when he came up with the Mets, he played primarily second base, but he played some third base, he played some outfield, and he played some first base, and up to play 162. He had, I can't think of another player that had worse baseball instincts than Greg Jeffries. This guy never knew what to do on the baseball field other than swing the bat. He didn't know where to throw the ball. He didn't know how to run to the... He was just a weird thing to see a guy...
It is interesting that he and Marinovich both had that exact same knock against him, where they had the prototypical body for their given sport and then absolutely no idea how to play it.
Had no idea out there. And so the Mets got... But he's one of those 4 guys, and as is Melvin Mora. So he came up with the Mets Mets in their playoff season in '99.
Yep. And he was an okay player for them. He was not, and then he went to the Orioles.
But he was versatile at that time. Even at the time when he first came up, his value to the Mets, like Kevin Mitchell's was in 1986. Kevin Mitchell played shortstop. He played outfield. He was this big guy. He could do different things on that particular team.
And that's what I think makes a utility guy very difficult, because it's so team specific. Because like if you have a stud second baseman and outfielder, then a utility guy that can play both of those positions is not nearly as valuable.
So Melvin Mora played the bulk of his career with the Orioles and was a very good player.
He turned into like a top level
accomplished
player
hitter,
for a few years.
Accomplished hitter, competent fielder. It was that they couldn't find a position where he could most contribute until he got to Baltimore.
He played to third.
I think so too. Yeah,
But
absolutely played.
Like the thing with Mora is, I don't think people appreciate that he put together some really good seasons.
Yes, and he ended up hitting even for a little power when you didn't know that when he was a young player that he was going to have that kind of ability to do that. I don't know if you're pulling his stats up.
I'm pulling his stats up right now because I was just because I remember him having like a couple seasons. Yeah, he had a career 28 WAR. He made the All-Star team a couple times.
Right. So this is a versatile player. Early in his career, you might have called him a utility player simply because on that '99 team he played a lot of positions.
It's just the kind of thing where, like in 2004, he hit 340 with 27 homers and 104 RBIs. That's a season.
Right. So this is a probably an underappreciated player. And as is another guy who finished his career, then you like to tease that this guy played until he was 50.
Didn't he?
He didn't. But Julio Franco has a career WAR of 43.6 and played a lot of positions on the baseball field, and none of them particularly well.
Okay, the other thing with Julio Franco is he could have been 50 because we honestly had no idea how old he was.
True, from where he came. Good player. The Braves and the Padres had a player, I believe, Mark Loretta, who also had 4 seasons where he played 162 games. Not a particularly accomplished player,
but he was useful, and I think that's
almost a utility player.
I think that's almost what you end up having with a lot of these utility guys, is that they're useful at the end of it. That they're nice. They're a luxury.
Right. There are 2 other guys that we should mention. One of them, or actually 3. So Tony Phillips, really good baseball player. I don't know if you're familiar with Tony Phillips's
not too
career,
much.
But he played for a bunch of teams. I think most prominently the A's, and he played a lot of years in the. His career WAR is 50.9. So this is an accomplished baseball player who hit 266 for his career. So let's see. He played 18 seasons in the major leagues, but it's his versatility and having played multiple positions, 4 different times, 162 games and more, that made him a really good player. Like I said, primarily for the Oakland A's.
Yeah, and then there was Michael Young, right?
There's a few Michael Young, so you have to specify which one.
He was the one that played for the Rangers.
The Rangers.
He played a bunch of different positions for them.
He played a long time.
Yeah.
Had a pretty good career, but that he did that is distinctive only because there's not that many guys.
But he would never have classified Young as a utility player because he would mostly play the same position throughout that entire one season.
Exactly. So that that season you played second base, maybe another season you played shortstop, or
maybe
something. You didn't go back and forth bouncing around.
Yeah, if you're bouncing around during the season, it's probably because you're not good enough to be a regular starter.
Or your team's not very good either. I think is another thing. No, a guy that I watched play as a kid. I never really thought much of this player. Don Money had a good name, right? He's probably the only baseball player whose last name was Money. Eddie Money being the
that's immediately what was good in my mind.
Different 2 Tickets to Paradise. We're not talking about that here. And Don Money played also 4 seasons of more than 162 games. He batted around 250. He just was a guy who could play a lot of positions. Had a couple of really good seasons that you would consider, but nobody that's an almost guy. He's not even into that category.
Yeah, no, not at all.
Not even close. So there is one guy left on this list.
Yeah, and he
who isn't a Hall of Famer.
He isn't.
He is not a Hall of Famer.
Who is it?
Okay, he should be a Hall of Famer.
Oh.
and it really surprised me that this player played that many positions, because you think of him as a hitter first. And the reason you think of him as a hitter first is he has more hits than anybody who ever played professional
And it's
baseball.
like you look at Pete Rose, played the thing with Rose that's impressive is the number of games he played at all of these different positions. Because a lot of these guys that are getting to these 3 and 4 marks, they would like cobble together 162 games at a position.
164. There were a few guys that had like 158s that I left off the list that might have kept them high.
But like that's because they cobbled together over a 15, 20 year career where like, yeah, of course, you know, you have a few games here and there every season and eventually technically you put together a full season at first base. But that's not what Pete Rose did.
No, he came up as a second baseman. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's what I remember. He came up as a second baseman, and his claim to fame was being the first $100,000 a year singles hitter in the major league. He was never a home run hitter, and that was a big deal to him that he got paid, and the Reds finally paid him.
Because that was the acknowledgement that his way of playing baseball was equally as valuable as some guy that could hit 40 home runs.
So, you know, to talk about $100,000, it has to be around 1970 or give or take.
Pretty good.
Or whatnot. Yeah, that was a lot of money then. Babe Ruth got paid, I think, $80,000 to play for the Yankees back in the 20s. Now, you had to think about the rate of inflation.
That's
I can't
insane.
even get into things like that. And so I think somebody quipped to Babe that, you know, well, you got paid more than the president. And Babe apparently snapped off, well, I had a better year than he did. I just, you know, love those old baseball stories.
That's
anyway,
a line.
So Pete Rose, you know, he had 1,300 games in the outfield.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess. I know he played lots of first base. I didn't guess he played 900 games at first base.
Pretty good.
You know, that's like 7 seasons. 600 at third base.
So, yeah, 600 at second. So he was playing multiple full seasons at multiple different positions. And that's very unusual.
Right, 6, 7 seasons at all those positions. And he won 2 Gold Gloves. Now, I would think that Rose was a competent fielder at all these positions.
Unfortunately for him, his Gold Gloves are. You don't know how much of those were kind of like career awards.
I know this was early in his career. I think he won his Gold Gloves in around 1970. But I just would have not put him as, you know, the most best versatile player of all time. I mean, could you make that argument, or would that be Biggio to you? Of those 2 guys, and
Biggio or Rose. It's really the only 2 of them in terms of who's the most. I would say that the problem is I think it's difficult to say because I don't know how good a defender Rose was at all of those different positions. And so
competent would be my word.
Competent, yeah. So I think in that way, I would say Biggio was a more versatile player because he was a plus defender at the 2 positions he played.
Yes.
Where like he was a good
Gold Glove caliber. Once he stopped, I mean, he went to Seton Hall, and I think he played with Mo Vaughn at Seton Hall actually. Mm-hmm. And he was a catcher and a good college catcher, and so they thought, well, naturally he'll be a good catcher in the pros, and they quickly, for the same reasons, going, like, this guy's got speed. We don't want to kill him back there behind the plate where we'll have no knees.
He was not a huge guy either.
No, he was not a huge guy.
So I think it's tough because, like, I would say Biggio was more. But Rose played 4 positions, so it's basically it's a toss-up, I think, between the 2 of them. Because on the one hand, you've got Rose's overall greater versatility, but you also have Biggio's higher success and peaks playing multiple positions.
But one of them's in the Hall of Fame,
and one of them's not. Now, but we would both say that both of them deserve to be in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, absolutely. The last player I'll mention is a guy who's playing now, who started his career, I didn't realize, as pretty much a utility player for the Cubs. Javier Baez.
Oh, I guess, yeah, because he did float around the infield a whole bunch. He's not really ever stuck to just one, but I guess he kind of he's just more of a middle infielder, because I don't know if he's ever played like much third or first.
So he finished second in the MVP in 18, hitting .290 with 34 homers, 21 steals, 111 ribbies, and 101 runs scored. That's a season.
That's a good, yeah.
But I thought what's more interesting is he had 104 appearances at second base that year, 65 at shortstop, and 22 at third base.
That's super.
That's a remarkable season.
Right. I think that's the kind of thing that probably doesn't get stuffed enough because that is unusual. That he was
bring the offense with that kind of being moved around.
And he was a regular player
right.
at all those different positions. He was an everyday player, and they were still moving him around regularly. That you don't see too often.
Within games a lot, because obviously if you add up 104, 65, and 22, you got a hell of a lot more than 162 in one
exactly.
season.
And like, even if that counts the postseason, that wasn't the year they won the World Series in 18, right? No. They won in
16.
Yeah. So it wasn't like, oh, they had a bunch of deep postseason run that year.
Right, exactly. So I guess just going back to Rose for a second, this guy just comes up with things about his career that I never really thought of him that way in terms of being possibly the most versatile player of all time. And you can argue Biggio the same thing, strictly because of the positions that Biggio played: catcher, second base, and center field.
Thanks for listening. Subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform.
And you can follow us on Twitter at Almost Coop.
the good.